Welcome back to our study of Leviticus. Let's talk for a moment about Jesus. One of the most consistent things that the New Testament emphasizes about the significance of Jesus is, I don't know if you've heard this before, Jesus died for our sins. You probably have, because it's a pretty common way of understanding something that is central to Christianity, something essential to faith in Jesus. And you may or may not know that this phrase is kind of a sacrifice type phrase. It's referring to Jesus' death as a sacrifice, as an atoning sacrifice that brings us back to God. Sometimes this is made explicit in the New Testament's description of what Jesus has come to accomplish. Maybe you hear in the back of your mind when John the Baptist first identifies Jesus in the Gospel of John, he says, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." That's sacrifice language. And neither John is unique in this regard. Matthew tells us that Jesus is given the name Jesus, meaning the Lord saves, because he will save his people from their sins. And when the gospel is finished, you realize that this happens through his death and resurrection. In Mark, Jesus himself says, "I did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give my life as a ransom for many." Chapter 10. Luke has written Luke and the book of Acts, and I think about how in the book of Acts, whenever Paul is talking to a group of church leaders in Acts 20, Luke records Paul describing the church as something that God has purchased for himself with his own blood. That blood is a reference to the sacrifices. Man, I don't know if you've read the letter to the Hebrews, but it is sacrificial through and through, and the others are as well. In Romans, Paul says that God has presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received with faith. In Galatians chapter 1, Jesus gave himself for our sins to rescue us from the present evil age. In Ephesians chapter 2, far and near are given peace with God through the blood of Christ. In other passages, 1 Peter chapter 3, he tells us that Peter does, that Jesus died, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. You keep going through this, you're going to keep finding more. In 1 John chapter 4, John says that God has showed his love among us by sending his son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. And of course, in Revelation chapter 5, it is with his blood that Christ has purchased men for God from every tribe and tongue and people and language. We could go on, but I think the point is sufficiently made. The New Testament makes a big deal about Jesus dying as a sacrifice for our sins. Now let's return our attention to the book of Leviticus. Look at how it starts. "The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting." This is a place that God has designed to meet with Moses and through by extension with the people. "He, that is the Lord, said, Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when anyone among you brings an offering to the Lord, bring as your offering an animal from either the herd or the flock." And we're off and running. And the whole really the first quarter of Leviticus, chapters 1 through 7, are all about the sacrifices. And so what we're going to do is we're going to devote our next two sessions to understanding the sacrifices, not trying to say everything that needs to be or could be said, but trying to say enough and to understand enough so that we can come back around to the text again and better understand what's going on so that we might better meditate on and respond to what God is communicating to us through this. Really, real quickly, what the text says is, and you can kind of trace it from that part where I read, there's a description of the 5 main sacrifices that God had instituted for the people of Israel. You've got the whole burnt offering is the first one, then the grain or the cereal offering is the second one, then you've got the peace offering or the fellowship offering. They kind of have different words because they're translated in different ways, is the third, then the sin or purification offering, and then the guilt offering is the last 5. So you kind of walk through all 5 of those for the first 5 or so chapters, and then he circles back around again and hits them all again with a little bit more of instructions specifically for the priest. So we're going to study these 7 chapters together for this section and this session and the next. And we'll do things in a little bit different ways. In the next session, I just want to dig into the details of those 5 sacrifices so that you can kind of look together, we can look together and understand what we can learn from each of them individually and collectively. But first, I think it might be helpful to get a big picture view. Why are we talking about all these sacrifices? And why are you leaving all these various details about, put your hand on the head of the animal and then say this and then cut the blood here and then splash it there? And it's very detailed and it's very gory. And to us living in, the 21st century world, most of us, it's just kind of very odd. We don't live in a world of blood and altars and meat sacrifices. And so it comes across as strange. And because of that, I think if we're going to meditate well on this text and discern God's voice in it, we do well to kind of back up and get a big picture. And so what I want to do for the rest of this particular session is give you 3 general points of reflection about what's going on in the sacrifices. And the first thing I want to point out is the biggest picture of what this is all about, and that is that God is inviting us, his people specifically, at the time Israel. God is inviting us, his people, back into his presence. Now, every word of that matters. Back into his presence means that like we had been there before or we're supposed to be there. And that's, of course, the story that the Bible tells. In the book of Genesis, God creates this world. In 7 days, he creates the heavens and the earth is this like temple slash kingdom slash garden. It's this beautiful place that God has built. And then he creates humankind to cultivate its fruitfulness and to rule over it on his behalf and to live in his presence. The original design for human beings was to live with this conscious and delightful awareness of God's presence, walking with him and working with him and enjoying growing in him in a peaceful way as we joyfully submit to his commands and as he continues to grow us up in his own time and in the ways that he sees fit. But you know what happened in the garden. Adam and Eve said, no thanks, we'd rather not pay attention to your rules because we feel like you're holding out on us, and so we're going to take matters into our own hands and we're going to eat the fruit you said not to eat. We're going to pursue wisdom on our own terms. And in that moment, the world broke. And they're actually told, you must leave the Garden of Eden. You have to get out of here. You can't live here anymore. You will no longer live in the direct presence of God. You will no longer live with this conscious and delightful awareness of God being with you, of walking with him in the garden and of doing work with him in joyful ways. And so they're separated from the garden, and we've been reeling ever since. What we lost, we can't regain on our own. Think about Psalm 15 that uses language that really has a lot to do with Leviticus. It's who can ascend the mountain of the Lord and who can dwell in his holy presence? There's an answer in the Psalm. The one whose walk is blameless. Tamim is the Hebrew word. Faultless. Without blemish. Is this you? I mean, sometimes, maybe you have some days that are less blemishy than others, but faultless, blameless, without blemish? No, not hardly. And so do you qualify? I mean, no, neither do I. And so we're shut out from the presence of God that we were made to live in. But God, who's rich in mercy, made a way for us. And he made a way right there in this Old Testament story by calling Abraham and calling his family to the means of his blessing. And Genesis tells the story of God blessing them and blessing others through them. And it ends well, but by the time you get to Leviticus, once again, we remind ourselves the people are in bondage in Egypt and they cry out to God and God delivers them. God rescues them from slavery and he's taking them through the wilderness into the promised land so that they might live in his presence, guiding them along the way. And in the process, he develops this covenant relationship with them and he wants to tell them how they can make a place for his presence. He's not telling them they have to come to him. He's saying, I'm going to come to you. But I'm going to tell you how this is going to work. And so after they have the covenant ratified in Exodus 24, Moses goes back up onto the mountain. And the next 6 chapters are very detailed instructions that God gives him about building this place of worship, this tabernacle, this tent that has these varying degrees of holiness because God's presence is actually going to dwell right in the middle of it, in this very sacred place that defines the identity of Israel. God is actually here. And so he gives him all these instructions in Exodus 25 through 31 about building this meeting place so that God and people can re-enter into a communion relationship of mutual love and affection and presence. But when Moses comes back down the mountain with the instructions, he sees that the people have worshipped an idol, a golden calf in Exodus 32. And so there's this moment of great judgment. Israel has repeated the same sin of Adam and Eve. No, we'd rather do things our own way. We'd rather create our own gods. And so they are judged for it. And you have this after the judgment. Now you finally, we have repented and taken care of this problem, and now we're building this place of worship that God has designed. And so you have another 5 or so chapters of detailed description of the building project that Israel engaged in. And so they build a tabernacle. And I don't know if you know this, the book doesn't end super well. You've built this place of worship, but check this out. I'm going to read in Exodus 40, verse 33. Then Moses set up the courtyard around the tabernacle and altar and put up the curtain at the entrance to the courtyard. And so Moses finished the work of building a meeting place for God and humanity, for God and Israel. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. God came down and showed up here. But the next verse is kind of weird. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. So you've got this place literally called the tent of meeting, but the one representative of the people who's supposed to go and meet with God there can't go in because humanity has been contaminated by sin in such a way that there's no way into his presence. That's how the book of Exodus ends. Now skip over Leviticus and look with me at the very beginning of the book of Numbers. Just the first verse. Look at the first verse of the book of Numbers, which follows Leviticus. The Lord spoke to Moses in the tent of meeting in the desert of Sinai on the first day of the second month of the wait. Hold on. Did you see that? The Lord spoke to Moses in the tent of meeting. So at the end of Exodus, Moses can't go into the presence of God. But at the beginning of Numbers, Moses is in the presence of God just fine. They're talking with one another. Like, what gives? What connects the two? And the answer, as you know, is the book of Leviticus. Sorry for the drama. You get the point. Leviticus is the book that connects the two. The book that tells us how God made a way for people to re-enter into his presence. It is not that God has said, come up here. It is that God has said, I am coming down to you, but I'm going to tell you how you may enter into my presence. Now, if you've grown up with the gospel, maybe this is kind of old news for you, but imagine if God shut the door and said no. It's hard to imagine that because, well, he hasn't. And so we're properly grateful and we want to pay attention to whatever he's going to say about how a reconciliation can occur, how we can come back into the presence of God for which we were made, how we can come near to the God who has come near to us. And if that's the part that you're used to, that God has made a way for us to enter in, then Leviticus indeed confirms that that is the case. But that's only the first of what Leviticus says, because the second thing I think we need to see by paying attention to these sacrifices, big picture, is that drawing near to God is not something to take lightly. It must never be taken lightly. No, drawing near is by all means the proper way to describe what's happening here. God has come near and he is inviting us to come near. That's the call of Leviticus. But it's worth thinking about what that entails and who it is we're actually drawing near to. I once knew somebody who said, I like to think of God as a sweet old grandpa inviting all us kids up onto his lap. I probably said something like that before, and although I'm not super comfortable with the first part, I like to think of God who are we to tell God who he is, right? But there is a sense in which that image of a kind and sweet grandfather and holding his grandchildren with love and affection is a proper way to understand God, but it's not the whole picture. And it's not actually the one we get here. God is not merely a sweet old man, and in the book of Leviticus, that's not the idea. No, he is a king summoning us into his dangerous presence. And the Lord called to Moses. That's not just, hey, why don't you come over and you get a minute? Or, hey, whenever you have some free time, I'd like to talk. No, that's a king saying, it is time for you to come in. And we're going to talk. And what he says is, here are the sacrifices I want you to offer. You get the point. It might be beneficial, even though we're going to look in more detail at the sacrifices next time through, and even then we can't read all of the text. I do want to read a portion of it together with you, just to get a sense of what it is in case it's not something you've read before. I'm gonna pick the short description of the peace offering from chapter 7. This is like the most chill one, all right? This is an offering that really isn't about like forgiveness per se. It's just an offering that the meaning of which we'll make clear later. But here are the words. Leviticus 7:11 says, "These are the regulations for the fellowship offering anyone may present to the Lord. If they offer it as an expression of thankfulness, then along with this thank offering, they are to offer thick loaves made without yeast and with olive oil mixed in, thin loaves made without yeast and brushed with oil, and thick loaves of the finest flour, well kneaded and with oil mixed in." You get the point, like we're looking at details. Keep going. Along with their fellowship offering of thanksgiving, they are to present an offering with thick loaves of bread made with yeast. They are to bring one of each kind as an offering, a contribution to the Lord. It belongs to the priest who splashes the blood of the fellowship offering against the altar. The meat of their fellowship offering of thanksgiving must be eaten on the day it is offered. They must leave none of it till morning. If, however, their offering is the result of a vow or is a free will offering, the sacrifice shall be eaten on the day they offer it, but anything left over may be eaten on the next day. Any meat of the sacrifice left over till the third day must be burned up. Check this out. If any meat of the sacrifice, I'm in verse 17, left over till the third day must be burned up. Then 18, if any meat of the fellowship offering is eaten on the third day, the one who offered it will not be accepted. It will not be reckoned to their credit, for it has become impure. The person who eats any of it will be held responsible. I keep reading. Meat that touches anything ceremonially unclean must not be eaten. It must be burned up. As for other meat, anyone ceremonially clean may eat it. But if anyone who is unclean eats any meat of the fellowship offering belonging to the Lord, they must be cut off from their people for eating the wrong meat. Anyone who touches something unclean, whether human or uncleanness, or an unclean animal, or any unclean creature that moves along the ground, and then eats of any of the meat of the fellowship offering belonging to the Lord, must be cut off from their people. I think you get the point. Leviticus is about holy things, and holy things are not to be trifled with. Leviticus is about a holy God, and a holy God is not to be messed with, and if you get sloppy with God's holy things, you may very well pay for it with your life. It wouldn't be the first time it's happened. And this goes on, you think about different stories, and I'm not sure if you've read these stories, but in 1 Samuel 4, we read that Eli the priest has two wicked sons, Hophni and Phinehas, and they're taking advantage of those who come to offer sacrifices, and they're eating meat wrongly, and they're sleeping with the women, and in the end, God puts them to death. That's the story. And maybe you know the story of Uzzah a little bit later on in the Old Testament. In 2 Samuel chapter 6, they're carrying the Ark of the Covenant, which is that which is supposed to be in the very heart of the tabernacle, the Holy of Holies, and they're carrying it on these poles, and then it starts to fall over as they're moving it from one place to another. And so he reaches out and touches it. And because he reached out and had the audacity to touch God's tabernacle, or God's Holy Ark of the Covenant, he dies. Now, it's not as random as it seems. They're not actually supposed to be carrying it that way. The previous mistake is the one that cost him his life. But again, you get the point that God is not to be trifled with, and drawing near to God must not be taken lightly. I don't know if you're surprised by this, but I don't know that we should be. Think about what God has taught us in creation. All of the things that are necessary for life threaten our death. Think about the elements, the earth, the air, the water, the fire. Earth is great, like I like to stand on it, but if it falls on me, I'm in trouble. Air is wonderful, but I don't want to find myself in a pressure chamber without the proper gear. Water's great, but too much of it and I'm going to drown. Fire's amazing. I like to watch it, but too much of it, not only do I like to watch it, but I like to have hot food, Stay warm in the winter, but too much of it and I'm in deep trouble. Think about the sun, that which for centuries has taught people about God. I mean, the sun is not something that is mean. The sun has no hard feelings towards you, but if you get too close to it without the proper gear, you're going to be toast. You're going to be in trouble because that is a thing not to be messed with. And what we're learning here is that in a similar sense, maybe, God is not to be messed with. And now to be clear, if you do not undergo these rituals, then God's wrath rests upon you, and you should not expect good things from him. You and God are not at peace. But if you do these rituals in a way that dishonors God, you should not expect good things from him. You and him are not at peace. And so there's a little bit of a tricky piece here where we're called to offer the sacrifices in order to be fit for his presence, but we have to offer them the proper ways. Being in proximity to God, being able to look, God is over there, does not guarantee that you are welcome in his presence. Even being invited by God, God has welcomed you in, does not guarantee that you are safe in his presence. There's an element of reverence here, an attitude of faith. And there's also an element of not just an attitude, but an action, a ritual here that God is calling for. So we have these two truths that God is inviting us back into his presence, but that this is dangerous. Like drawing near to God is not to be taken lightly. And this takes us to the third. God provides sacrifices of atonement as our way back in. He provides rituals. You bring an animal, you slaughter it in a certain way. It must be a certain animal. You then spread the blood and you do things with the meat, and it's rituals. Now, I don't know how you feel about ritual, but before you go all anti-ritual on me, be patient, and we'll try to understand why God might have instituted these things and how that might be instructive for us, especially who have a little bit of an allergic reaction to ritual. No, Dad, ritual is what we're trying to avoid. I want a real relationship with God. Well, this was a real relationship. That's part of the point. The rituals are relational. They're actually how the relationship is maintained between God and his covenant people. They're also educational. Actually help the people understand who God is and what they're doing. Sometimes they don't actually explain the meaning because the point is that you can't understand the meaning unless you engage in the ritual. They are what teach you. They're what provide you knowledge of God and his will for you, and they teach you how things work. And all of this centers on the idea of atonement. The word atonement in English is a great word, at-one-ment. Kippur is a word that it comes from in the Hebrew, but the unfortunate thing about this, I want to be real with you, is that the meaning of this word is a little bit complex. It's not entirely clear exactly what this word means. Like when we talk about atonement, are we talking about forgiveness? Like a thing is in trouble, but then no longer in trouble? The sins aren't held against them? Or are we talking about like less forgiveness, but more like a cleansing? This thing is not so much in trouble, but it's just dirty and it needs to be cleaned up. And so you're cleaning it up. Or are we talking about like raising it up to a special level? I mean, it's hard to know. There are actually two possible etymologies for the word in Hebrew that is translated atonement. But even these really just take us back to the same place. One of them means to wipe clean. It might come from a word that means to wipe clean, or it might come from a word that means to pay a ransom. Two very different things. Are we cleaning something off, or are we paying a ransom so that this thing might actually be brought back in a safe way? And we'll actually have to pay attention to this as we study, because it's not always one or the other. Sometimes it's one, sometimes the other. Can't always be forgiveness, because atonement is offered for physical objects that didn't sin. but it can't always be only cleansing because sometimes forgiveness is specifically tied to it. As is the case with most of Leviticus, these things are best taken one instance at a time. But I do want to draw attention to my chart that you've probably been wondering why this is up here. This is not something I created, but it is something that I've certainly found helpful. One of the things that makes Leviticus challenging is that it's using categories that are maybe a little bit foreign to us and could be different from how we might tend to think about things. And so really you've got these like three levels. You've got holy, which is the highest level. And the best way to think about holiness in regard to what we're talking about here first is that it is something that is fit for God's presence. It's not just moral holiness, although that's a component of it. There's also like a ritual holiness. It has been made capable and competent for God's presence. That's the key idea. And on the bottom, you've got something that is unclean. Now, unclean might mean sinful. Like there's a sense in which unclean sometimes is a matter of straight up sin. But other times, like if you sin, you are unclean. You're not fit for presence. But other times, like it's not so much that you've sinned, it's just that you're maybe stained would be a way of putting it. Again, we'll talk about it as we go. Just know that you've got these three grades, holy, unclean, and in the middle this is the part that's a little tricky for us, is there's this middle level. So for something to be unclean means that it is absolutely unfit for God's presence. It is actually dangerous for it to come into God's presence because it's going to result in negative consequences. It needs to be cleansed. But once it's cleansed, that doesn't necessarily mean it's holy. That just means it's common or clean. So you could be clean and not holy. I know, strange. Another move has to happen in which you are sanctified. So you have to move from unclean to clean and from clean to sanctified, made fit for God's presence. Similarly, it works in the other direction. You can be holy, but then if you come into contact with something unclean, or even if you just lack the ongoing whatever it is you need to be holy, you could be profaned, which in this context doesn't mean like saying bad words or something. It just means you're now common. And if you are polluted from common, then you become unclean. I know it's a lot to kind of think through and be aware of, but there's a couple of things I want to say for now. 2 points to make for now, and then we'll be done. One point is that although there is no escaping the fact that this is going to be confusing the first time you study it, I don't want us to get more caught up in the fact that this is kind of unclear than the fact that this is unflattering. So I am not saying you're only acting like you don't understand because you don't want to come to terms with how sinful you are. No, if you're reading Leviticus and you're confused, like, well, sometimes welcome to the club, and it's a confusing book. Not all of the I's are dotted, not all the T's are crossed. But what I'm saying is, yeah, like, okay, fine, it's not entirely clear, but enough of it is clear for us to develop an understanding of what it's saying about us, and what it is saying about us is not particularly flattering. That for any number of reasons, we should be disqualified from God's presence. That's the first point. Second thing I want you to note is that the primary reason why I wanted to draw this is I wanted you to understand that sin or impurity is anything that moves you from holiness toward uncleanness. And the sacrifices, here's the key thing, are anything that raise you from uncleanness toward holiness. So a sacrifice might be moving you from unclean to clean, or clean to holy, or maintaining your holiness, or celebrating your cleanness, or celebrating your wholeness. But the whole thing to understand is that the sacrifices are all about moving you closer up to God's presence. So once more, I know I've given you a lot, but this is why we only have 3. The most important thing for you to understand about the sacrifices, big picture, is that God is inviting us back into his presence. He has come down and he is inviting us in. The second thing to understand is that drawing near to God must not be taken lightly. It is a very serious thing. And to take it lightly is, we'll just say, dangerous. The third thing to see is that God provides the sacrifices of atonement as our way back in, as the means by which we might have a reconciled relationship to him. Next session, we will look together at the 5 main sacrifices. For now, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace.